Wel, fesgur maach harstin, agus fáilte dat go Òraid vlional yn dôl fod. Me fiannach acafse had yn groch i yen fydd droch emisio dan y barstin gan dwych son y fi colodyn sio yn diw. A cha yn emisio dat biarn ag agal na'r misg, agus mwysien hana over hangelach gyfel yn Òraid sio ga crwlwy yn ytterlien ac o yw ga fiad y crwlwy yn ytterlien, agus befalym fáilte chwyd edefse ule ha colodyn tron y fian sien cwtich. Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to the 17th Sabhal Mòr Annual Lecture. And let me include in that welcome, as I've just done in Gaelic, those joining us on the World Wide Web. Winter having come early to many parts of Scotland, the weather has inevitably had an impact on the numbers attending this year's lecture, and my congratulations to you hardy souls who have made it to be here, none hardier nor further travelled than the giver of this year's lecture. We'll come to him in a moment. But again, as I've just been saying in Gaelic, that makes it a cause of particular gratitude that this year's lecture is being carried, or is to be carried, on the World Wide Web. And it is appropriate at this point that I thank the staff of MG Alapu who have helped us make that possible. I should also thank at this point our sponsors for this year's lecture, Harris Tweed Hebrides, a company, a newish company, who are doing exciting and innovative things with Harris Tweed, transforming its image, certainly, and we hope in due course its fortunes in the Western Isles. And in that connection, let me prove to you my own credentials by flashing my orb. This jacket is too old to have been made by Harris Tweed Hebrides, but it's Harris Tweed nevertheless. Now, the Sabhal Mòr lecture has, over the years, acquired considerable status. That's a tribute to the quality of those who have given it, all of them, without exception, people of particular distinction and eminence in their own fields. Of course, it also says something about Sabhal Mòr, that it's able to attract people of the calibre of, for example, Mary Robertson, who gave the lecture when she was the President of the Irish Republic, and 3 years ago, the First Minister for Scotland, Alex Salmond. Now, as these names might suggest, the preponderance of those who have given this lecture over the years have been politicians, or at least people from the world of current affairs. By way of further example of that, the lecture has also been given by the late Donald Dewar when he was First Minister of Scotland, by Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and last year by the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning, Michael Russell, who was then just days into his new responsibilities in that post. So all of that makes it a particular pleasure to welcome to give this year's lecture someone who's not a politician at all, at least not a politician in that narrow sense. Instead, we welcome someone from the world of the arts. In May of this year, Andrew Dixon was appointed Chief Executive Designate of Creative Scotland, the successor to the Scottish Arts Council, and Creative Scotland itself formally came into being on the 1st of July this year. Now, it is quite remarkable, and for us very gratifying, that although he's been in the post for only some 7 months, this is not Andrew Dixon's first visit to Sabhal Mòr. It's not even his second visit to Sabhal Mòr. It's his third visit to Sabhal Mòr. So, Andrew, we have pleasure not only in welcoming you, but in welcoming you back. Now, I mentioned the bad weather at the start and the effect it's had on numbers. A number of people travelling from a distance have had to call off. In that respect, Andrew Dixon puts us all to shame. I said there are none here hardier and none further travelled. Well, Andrew Dixon got out of his bed in Northumberland at 6 o'clock yesterday morning, and by dint of a train, first to Edinburgh, then to Inverness, then to Kyle, made it here last night. So we're very grateful to you, Andrew, for that. Now, before I say more about Andrew's background and ask him to deliver this year's lecture, I want him to sample something of what goes on at the college here. So we're going to have a taste of something from our traditional music course. Our traditional music course, which has recently become an honours course, is under the charge of Dr. Decker Forrest at the back there. And we're very proud of all that Decker and his students achieve on that course. And they're just about to show you why. Thank you, Decker. Thank you, students. Now, let me introduce Andrew Dixon to you a little more fully. Andrew Dixon has a long and distinguished record stretching over 30 years in the arts, and his interests, involvements and achievements are far too numerous to mention in a brief introduction such as this. A Mancunian by birth, he was brought up in Kendal in the Lake District, but most of his work in recent years has been done in the other corner of England, in the northeast of England, in Northumberland. Andrew began his artistic career as director of youth projects at the Major Road Theatre Company. He then spent 5 years as an arts officer in local government in England before joining Northern Arts as its chief executive. In that role, he transformed the image of the northeast of England in the arts, particularly perhaps in the visual arts, including in that some unmissably visible manifestations, such as the Angel of the North. But he was also instrumental in the creation of the Sage Gateshead, which is a creative music performance venue, and also in the formation of the Northern Film and Media Agency. And when the regional arts bodies in England amalgamated to become the Arts Council England, Andrew was responsible for leading Northern Arts into that new structure. And on that process having been completed, he became a director of the Arts Council England with responsibility for its regional lottery programme. Clearly a man with a passion for the northeast of England, 5 years ago he became chief executive of the Newcastle Gateshead Initiative, promoting Newcastle Gateshead as a world-class place to live, work, learn and visit. In 2005, he was voted Alternative Businessman of the Year for his public sector work, and in 2008, his many achievements in and for the northeast of England were recognised in the form of an honorary degree from the University of Northumbria. His many other interests include non-executive roles on the Council of Durham Cathedral, as a governor of Gateshead College, as an advisor to a creative industries organisation called Mushroom Works, and on the development committee of Theatre Royal. Ladies and gentlemen, much more could be said about Andrew Dixon, but time forbids. I will, however, say this, that in the short time that he's been in his post, he has already proved himself a good friend of this place, a good friend of Sabhal Mòr Ostaig. And we look forward now to hearing what he has to say about that continuing and, to us, very important relationship in his lecture. So, Andrew, it is a very great pleasure for me, as chair of the board of Sabhal Mòr, to welcome you to Skye and to Sabhal Mòr Ostaig. Skye may not be Newcastle Gateshead, but we'd like to believe that it too is a world-class place to live, work, learn and visit. So you should feel quite at home here. So it's a particular pleasure now for me to invite you to deliver this year's annual lecture under the title Developing a Creative Nation.
A couple of things flashed through my mind. One, when there's bad weather, when you used to work in touring theatre, you always cleared the back 2 rows of the village hall just so that it looked very full. But obviously we didn't need to do that here. The other thing, when I used to be a rock music promoter, there was a golden rule that the support band mustn't be more entertaining than the main act. Clearly, we've got that wrong today, Donny. This has happened to me a few times in recent weeks. I play in a band, and the other week I turned up and there was a bit of surprise about who the support act was going to be. And it turned out to be the winner of the X Factor. So there was no pressure there, and there's no pressure here. And of course, there's been a few predecessors to this lecture. I'm very grateful for Boyd and Donny and the board for inviting me here. But when I noticed that previous speakers included Gordon Brown, Alex Salmond, and they all came bearing gifts and commitments, it was slightly daunting. And then I realised that probably in the current spending review, it was probably a good move not to have a politician delivering this lecture. Although sometimes it does feel like the role of Chief Executive of Creative Scotland is somewhat political. We're sorting out the social politics of the arts in Scotland. We're addressing some economic issues. We're also dealing with issues of disadvantage in terms of where the arts reach within Scotland. And there's one or two cultural conflicts around, which no doubt I'll have to turn my hand to. I was actually recently asked about my political credentials, and I pointed somebody to an old Facebook site where I described my politics as northern. And I've always been very committed to being in the north, previously the north of England, the northwest, the mid-north, as they call it, Yorkshire, and the northeast. And I've always had a very strong affinity to Scotland, I suppose, out of living in those borderlands of Cumbria and Northumbria for 40 years of my life and spending so much time up here in Scotland. This is my 9th visit to the Highlands and Islands since I was appointed in May. My PA said, "You're going to Inverness again on December the 7th, Andrew. How many times is that you've been up there?" And I said, "Well, how many times have I been to Glasgow?" It's very important to me that if we're looking after Creative Scotland, we're looking after the whole country and being seen to give everyone an equal presence in terms of our work. And I'm delighted to be here in this very special place of Sabhal Mòr for the 3rd time. I wanted to start, however, by asking the audience a couple of questions just so I could get a gauge on where you've come from. How many of you are from banking? No hands. How many of you from car manufacturing? No hands. How many of you work in the creative industries or education? Hands up. Ah, right. Well, this may not be scientific, but at least it's circumstantial evidence that there are more people that work in the creative industries than work in car manufacturing or banking. Now, I have to be slightly careful here because my chairman, Sandy Crombie, is a banker. And I would hesitate to suggest that banking isn't important to the image of Scotland. It is very important. But I will put it to you that arts and creativity have a far more central role to play in defining Scotland's contribution to the world. And that's the premise of what I want to talk about today. I'd like to work the audience a little harder just so I can give you a bit of background about myself. How many of you went to see a careers officer when you were at school? Hands up, can you remember going to see about age of 15, 16? Yeah? And how many people said that you were going to work in the creative industries or the knowledge economy? Keep your hands up. 1. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? The kind of reflection on this as an industry, way back, it never really was seen as a major career. Now, I went to see the careers officer, admittedly, in Kendal in Cumbria. I think it was the French teacher who did it once a year in June, and people came to him for 20 minutes. And I went in, and I came out, and I was going to be a town planner. I was quite good at geography, but I was going to be a town planner, and this was a bit of a blow at the time because I wanted to be a rock musician. But I came home and I told my mother, I'm going to be a town planner, Mum. And she said, "What's one of those?" I said, "Well, I don't really know." And I didn't really think any more about this for many, many years until about 15 months ago, and I was stood doing a lecture at the Royal Town Planning Institute in London, and I realised that actually for quite a sizable part of my life, that is what I've been. I've been a town planner, planning towns, planning places through culture, and the role that the arts and culture plays in society, and the difference that arts and culture makes in defining different places. So I now feel quite comfortable calling myself a quasi-town planner. But I arrived in Scotland at 1:30 on the 12th of February, about 6 years after Creative Scotland was first mooted, and 4 hours before my first press conference. The birth of Creative Scotland, the non-departmental public body, had been very long and drawn out. But actually the birth of Creative Scotland, the nation, is deeply rooted and goes back many decades, indeed many centuries. I suppose the new Creative Scotland's role is to interpret Creative Scotland in 2010. Having been to the west coast of Scotland many times on holidays, my first trip to Edinburgh was to perform in the Edinburgh Fringe with a theatre company. My first trip to Glasgow was to see Peter Brook's Mahabharata in the capital of culture. My first trip to Dundee was to see Dundee Contemporary Arts from 10 years ago. My first trip to Aberdeen was to a gig at the Lemon Tree. And my first trip to Pitlochry was to see its festival theatre. OK, so I work in the arts. However, I think it does say something about the fact that culture does define places. and that people do associate places with the arts and culture. I saw Mall Theatre a couple of weeks ago at the Tron Theatre in Glasgow, and I always remember holding in my mind that Mall Theatre was the smallest theatre in the world. It's facts like that that actually identify the differences between places. I was in Stockholm recently to speak to local authorities and cultural leaders in Sweden. And they're watching Creative Scotland with great interest. There's a lot of similarities between Sweden and Scotland. But I flew out of Newcastle Airport, and I felt some pride as I came out of the airport and saw images of great cultural projects in the northeast of England. The Angel of the North, the Sage Gateshead, and Klaus Oldenburg's sculpture The Bottle of Notes in Middlesbrough. In the northeast, I spent about 20 years redefining the place through culture, and I sat reflecting on this as I left the airport and did feel very pleased that these images were outliving my stay and hopefully many other people's stay in the northeast. And I was sat on the plane scribbling notes for this lecture, actually, and I picked up one of the British Airways magazines. Very rarely read them. But I picked up this magazine, and it was guest edited by Tracy Emin, the artist. Now, people might remember 20 years ago, British Airways used to paint their tailgates, and they were painted by artists, and every one of their planes had a different artist's tailgate on it. It was a very clever piece of branding, essentially saying we're about Britain and we're about British creativity. But it's a big step from there to getting one of Britain's most famous artists and controversial artists to edit your corporate PR with a circulation of 2.5 million readers. Anyway, the magazine had the word Fife on the front cover. So I was immediately drawn into it. Now you think Visit Scotland, doing their job well and promoting the Open at St Andrews or the beaches on the Fife coast. You'd be wrong. The article on Fife was about Jack Vitriano and how he associated his success as a painter with a sense of rootedness in place. And I thought that was relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. I then arrived at Stockholm Airport, and I've been to Stockholm once before, and the walls in Stockholm Airport are lined with faces. The faces are of writers, musicians, film directors, and the cultural and sporting icons of Stockholm. One or two members of ABBA, I suspect, amongst them. Welcome to Stockholm. Welcome to the things that make us distinctive. Welcome to the things that make us proud of where we live. Culture, defining the place, defining the difference between Stockholm and Gothenburg, the difference between Stockholm and Manchester. Now, airports are the ultimate dens of global merchandising. You've all been there, W.H. Smith's, Ritazza Coffee, same duty-free displays with 3-for-2 deals on Toblerone. You won't be able to get the 3-for-2 deals on alcohol in Scottish airports very soon, but it's everywhere you go, it's the same. And yet, here were two different airports differentiating themselves through culture. And if you go to Copenhagen Airport, you'll find that it's one of the biggest art commissioning agencies for public art in Europe, and that Manchester Airport is a major sponsor of the International Festival in Manchester. And if you go to Schiphol Airport, it actually has an art gallery and museum in the airport itself. Now, does this suggest that the arts and creative industries might have some national importance? I put it to you that it does. These airports are multi-million-pound operations, and they wouldn't be using culture to define themselves if it weren't of some value. So I go back to the 12th of February when I met the journalists for the first Creative Scotland press conference. They asked the inevitable questions about my Scottish credentials and why I'd left the seemingly vibrant scene of Newcastle Gateshead. But just as my move to Newcastle 20 years ago, it was the place that had drawn me and the cultural strengths that had taken little to persuade me to enter a creative nation. Now, Creative Scotland, the organisation, may be a merger of the Arts Council and Scottish Screen, but we see it as something very different. I've been keen to stress that Creative Scotland isn't an institution. We want it to be a rallying call, and I'll come back to the rallying call later. We want everybody to get behind the concept of promoting Creative Scotland as a place and a nation. The two words are pretty powerful, creative and Scotland. But we want to ensure that they're synonymous with success and not just a cash machine in Edinburgh that gives out grants. We see Creative Scotland as a champion and advocate, not just a funder. Its role now brings together the arts, film and creative industries. And our functions also include international promotion of Scotland's culture and a commitment to celebrating its languages. Alba Cruachal, our Gaelic name, sits along Creative Scotland to demonstrate our commitment. Interestingly, after myself, the next appointee to Creative Scotland was Brianna Hydra, our Gaelic officer, shared with Bord na Gaelic. He, alongside myself, will be a champion for Creative Scotland. But we're born in a world where creative barriers are being torn down by cultural collaboration and new technology. I was speaking recently at an excellent conference in Inverness organised by High and High Arts. And it was about old maps and new maps. And I talked about, whilst maps and nations have borders, the arts and creativity never did. And now the barriers to global audiences are being removed as well. Old maps had borders, new maps don't. The web and broadcasting provide new opportunities for access and distribution of film, music, the visual arts and digital creation. So Creative Scotland needs to define itself in different ways. Our board is but 3 meetings old and we're still defining our mission objectives. But we're trying to create a new language, a language that talks of Scotland as being recognised as a creative nation, one that attracts, develops and retains talent, and where the arts and creative industries are supported and celebrated and their full economic contribution is captured. More importantly, perhaps, a nation where the arts plays a central part in the lives, education and well-being of our population. I've worked in arts councils for many years and I've tried to ban the word subsidy and funding from the spell checker. We're trying to use some new language in Creative Scotland. We're talking about investing, and some people may say that investment is a dirty word, perhaps more closely associated with banking. But if you look at the definition for investment in the dictionary, it talks about spending time, spending money, or committing energy to something that is worthwhile. To say that we don't invest in the arts is to say that they're not worthwhile, and we believe they are. So our language will be to invest in talent, to invest in quality production, to invest in audiences, access and promotion, participation, to invest in the cultural economy, and to invest in places. And the invest in places is very important because it's about investing in the places and their contribution, wherever they are in Scotland, to a creative nation. Creative Scotland will define itself through artists, but it will also define itself through geography and through the communities that contribute so much to defining the difference between ourselves and Sweden. I was reminded recently of a councillor from a local authority in Gateshead when we were developing the Angel of the North. It was fairly controversial sculpture, and myself and Sid Henderson had to defend it in the press for about 3 or 4 years. And I remember Sid Henderson saying, you know, you can go down any city high street in England and you will see W.H. Smiths and Currys and at that time Woolworths, but you won't see an Angel of the North in Coventry. And the culture for him was what defined Gateshead. And everywhere I've travelled in Scotland, from Dumfries to Dunfermline to Orkney, there's a unique contribution being made to a Creative Scotland. This, for those that haven't been there, is the pier in Orkney. Absolutely wonderful collection and gallery right at the hub of Stromness. Let me say something, though, about the importance of the universities and colleges sector. We sit here today in a wonderful, inspiring building, but we also sit here within the midst of global competition. I read recently, thanks to Jean Urquhart, a lecture that Professor Tony Jones had made for UHI, where he highlighted that China's 20 top art colleges had 10,000 students each. 20 art colleges with 10,000 students each. But there's another 400 colleges being developed with the same numbers. Now, we only have a few thousand students at our universities and colleges studying cultural subjects here, but I feel it's a real and growing strength in Scotland. Now, the press don't get the wrong end of what I'm saying here, for those that are listening to this on the web. China might make Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, Glasgow School of Art and RSAMD look like the corner shops in the global supermarket of education. But what we have in Scotland is quality and distinctiveness, inspiring places to learn. And this campus, the new RSAMD at Spears Lock in Glasgow, Mackintosh's masterpiece, the School of Art, and the new plans for Glasgow School of Art, provide facilities and teaching that can rival anywhere in the world. Then there's the games industry in Abertay and Dundee, and the remarkable campus at Grays in Aberdeen. Their strengths, amongst other things, lie in their local roots and their relationship to a place. The fact that RSAMD courses have 20 applicants for every student place says it all. But they do sit in a global market, but they differentiate themselves by where they're based. I was speaking recently at the AGM of Fèis na Gael in Ullapool, and I went onto the web and did a little bit of research, which I have to do in a new place. And I found 1.1 million pages on Google relating to the Fèis movement. 1.1 million pages on Google. The web gives us access to the world's culture, but it also gives the world access to ours. Now, I don't know what the average audience is for a traditional music gig in Fort William. Obviously a lot higher when Donny Munro's playing. But an artist these days can get something like 20,000 hits on YouTube. So issues of rurality are no longer a barrier to large-scale audiences. There's a project in Glasgow. It's an online artist project called Central Station. It has over 3,000 artists exhibiting and taking part in what are called crowdsourced decisions over small grants for projects. Basically, artists determining themselves which artists should be supported. This sort of creative activity is new territory for Creative Scotland. We inherit this as part of our role in the creative industries. And Central Station is a small office on a fourth-floor tenement of a Glasgow office, hosted by a company called ISO. ISO is a team of designers, directors, animators, software developers and producers. Their studio actually specialises in motion graphics and the dynamic content for interactive experiences. They designed the front page of the BBC iPlayer. They're designing a new museum experience for St Paul's Cathedral. But this is the new territory of creative industries that the arts and film now join within a Creative Scotland. The size of the sector is very significant, and in Scotland it's growing faster than many other parts of the economy. Here in the Highlands and Islands, HIE celebrated at the conference just a few weeks ago 20 years of commitment to this sector. The number of creative businesses that have grown in the Highlands and Islands is really very significant. The number of cultural organisations that are now based here. But looking across Scotland as a whole, the Scottish Government did a study which suggested that this sector has a turnover of £5.2 billion a year, employing 58,000 people. That's 3% of the workforce of Scotland. So, culture and creativities are important, and that's why there were more hands went up at the start of this lecture than went up for banking or car manufacture. But culture is also an important calling card for Scotland, whether it be our orchestras in Paris, the 350 performers at the Delhi Handover, or the National Theatre performing their production of Black Watch. I've been hugely impressed by the scale and range of international work. Dog Star Productions, a company with a base with High Arts, their show The Tailor of Inverness has been to Australia, Sweden, Ukraine and Germany. And it's just been invited to go to Iran, Israel and Belarus. So this isn't the major national companies. This is small creative outfits from across the whole of Scotland. And the role of individual artists is also very important in this. They can be hugely important cultural diplomats for Scotland. I went to see Martin Creed's exhibition at the Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh. I actually went 3 times. It's a very, very special exhibition. But on the wall of the exhibition was Martin Creed's CV. He actually wasn't born in Scotland. I think he moved to Glasgow when he was 3 years old. But to read his CV was to look at a trail finder's brochure. He's exhibited and performed across the world, in Tokyo, Jerusalem, USA, Italy, Germany. Individual artists are as important as our major companies as cultural ambassadors for a creative Scotland. Our musicians, filmmakers and writers may work in a primary language, but their work can transcend cultures across the world. Now, whether Bill Forsyth or J.K. Rowling will retain the fame or longevity of Walter Scott remains to be seen, but they immediately have the advantage that their work is being created on a world stage. We have the internet, we have the ability to take our culture across the globe. And culture and creativity is becoming a part of the brand of Scotland. And one of our measures at Creative Scotland will be to see how we are perceived internationally through a thing called the Nation Brand Index. Now, at present, Scotland sits about 18th for culture when compared with 50 similar nations, places like Austria, New Zealand, probably Sweden in there. But I think we deserve to be higher than 18th. And I'll put it to you that Scotland has an ability to hide things. It's got an inbuilt cultural modesty that precludes it from celebrating anything that's successful in the arts. And we need to do something about that because, in terms of how we're perceived internationally in the world, we need to be promoting the quality and success of culture in Scotland much more loudly than we have done in the past. We need to make the most of our cultural assets. When I was applying for the job, I knew of several arts organisations in Scotland, and I was aware of many of the festivals, but I wanted to research a little bit more. I went onto the Visit Scotland website, and I found about 7 or 8 festivals. Now, understandable that they would only promote the big events like the Edinburgh International Book Festival. But when I asked the Arts Council for a list of the festivals that they funded, I found there were 38 festivals. And when I arrived, I found that there were 40 literature festivals alone. And there are actually now on my list 181 festivals across Scotland, 77 of which are here in the Highlands and Islands. Some of these are large-scale events like Edinburgh. Others are relatively small, homegrown events with niche audiences. But together they represent nothing short of an international phenomenon. Scotland is the festival nation, not just in August in Edinburgh, but all year round. Celtic Connections in January, Glasgow International in April, Imaginate, Children and Young People's Festival in May, Perth Festival in June, Cromarty Film Festival this weekend in December. Many of them do extremely well, but there must be more that we can do to shine a light and promote the collective strength of festivals across Scotland. If festival means celebrate, let's celebrate the celebrations. Let's make people aware that there are festivals happening 52 weeks of the year across Scotland. These are not just worthy local events. Many of them are world-class and absolutely rooted in places. And whilst Creative Scotland will have economic objectives and will measure the growth in the cultural economy and things like cultural tourism, we'll also have social objectives. And access to the arts for local people will be a very key measure to us. The good news is that 90% of people in Scotland access the arts at least once a year. 90% of people in Scotland access the arts at least once a year. The bad news is that that isn't the same percentage across all the population or all the geography of Scotland, or older people, or certain areas of disadvantage. And we need to make sure that we're addressing that 10% that aren't having access to the arts. Many people will recognise this image as being from the Fèis movement. When I arrived in Newcastle Gateshead some 21 years ago, it was closed. It was closed on a Sunday, it was closed on a Monday. Actually, it was closed most Tuesday, Wednesday nights. It had the lowest level of attendance in the arts in the UK. And when we analysed further, it was down to a fundamental lack of opportunity, a fundamental lack of facilities, and a lack of the ability for young people and others to access or engage with the arts. There were, however, one or two amazing exceptions. I attended a traditional music event some 20 years ago, inspired by the Fèis movement here. It was run by an organisation called Folkworks, who later went on to develop the Sage Gateshead. But inspired by what had been happening here, engaging young people in music, they ran a youth summer school. And I always remember the banner on the back of the stage, and it's probably copied directly from the early Fèis banners, said, "Tradition in the making." Tradition in the making. That was 20 years ago. 10 years later, I went back, and the young people were the tutors. And last year, I went to see a concert by Sting, and the musicians were the kids who'd been in the workshops some 20 years earlier. One of the most impressive people I've met since arriving in Scotland, and I've met a lot of impressive people, but one of the most impressive I've met is Fiona Dalgetty of Fèis Ross. She's been on the same journey: participant, musician, tutor, apprentice, chief executive of a major cultural organisation. I'm certain that people like Fiona will play a major part in Scotland's creative future. And my reason for mentioning Fiona specifically is that I think career paths will be critically important to a creative Scotland. I recently went to see a show called A Wee Home from Home by a company called Plan B. And this show, small production, 3 performers, didn't have a programme with CVs where you found out how many times people had performed in Taggart. They had this roadmap, a bit like the London Underground, with a route of the careers of each of the choreographer, the musician, the designer. And for me, this sums up the role of Creative Scotland and our engagement with agencies such as Sabhal Mòr Ostaig and RSAMD. These artists had moved through various companies, colleges, teaching positions. They'd moved across Scotland, they'd forayed into England, they'd worked internationally, they'd strayed out of theatre and into music, but ultimately they'd come back to being rooted in a place and contributing to a Creative Scotland. Musicians like Michael Mara from Dundee, director Jerry Mulgrew, and choreographer Frank McConnell. Creative Scotland has to develop its plan for how it will engage with talent. We can't do everything on that roadmap. We have to make choices. We think there's an important role to play at the start of people's careers as we take people out of education and provide opportunities that bring them in to that rail system, give them that first opportunity, that first rung on the ladder. We also think there's a need to work with some of our best artists at the peak of their careers, to find ways that we engage the best writers, performers, artists and filmmakers to continue to work and contribute to Creative Scotland, even if they have international credentials like Martin Creed or J.K. Rowling. Interestingly, the Arts Council gave a grant to J.K. Rowling many, many years ago, and we ought to track a little more sophisticated way the careers of artists and how small investments by agencies like Creative Scotland can make a difference at key moments in artists' careers. I put it to you that Scotland is very well provided for culturally. I thought we had a pretty good setup in the northeast of England and Newcastle Gateshead. But some of those who are closest to the cultural sector in Scotland just don't realise how good the situation is here. We're very fortunate to have the national companies, the RSNO, the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, Scottish Opera, Scottish National Ballet and the National Theatre of Scotland. These are complemented by national youth orchestras, national youth choirs, national youth dance, and Creative Scotland invests in some 50 foundation organisations and another 60 major cultural producers. This is a fantastic set of organisations for a nation so small. If you just look at classical music, in the northeastern Cumbria, where I've come from, we had a fantastic orchestra, the Northern Symphonia, who served the northeastern Cumbria. That's a population of just under 3 million people, and it had 40 professional orchestral players. Here in Scotland, with just twice that population, we've got the RSNO, Scottish Chamber Orchestra, BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, and then a whole raft of others like Hebrides Ensemble, Dunedin Consort, Scottish Ensemble, not to mention the ballet and opera orchestras, probably about 250 players at a conservative estimate. Now, I've already talked about the number of festivals, but let's go a little further into the scale and quality of them. Edinburgh, 11 events, 12 if you count the Science Festival, across 7 months. It represents the largest festival in the world. This year, the Fringe had 2,470 separate productions, many of them produced from across Scotland. The Edinburgh International Book Festival is the largest in the world. The Glasgow and Edinburgh Film Festivals are the second and the third largest in the UK. The St Magnus Festival in Orkney, 34th year and going strong, a world-class event originated by an individual artist. Glasgow International, every 2 years, a visual arts festival filled with projects, events, exhibitions, screenings and performances conceived and produced by organisations and artists based in the city. And Celtic Connections, a world-class showcase of Scottish music from across the globe, attracting over 100,000 people and 1,500 musicians to Glasgow in January. I'm particularly looking forward to Celtic Connections in January. And just at the moment, we're bidding with Glasgow City and the UNESCO City of Music for Glasgow to host WOMEX, which is the World Music Expo. I was involved in bidding to host this event in Gateshead, and it attracts around 2,300 people, musicians, from over 70 countries, and it would be absolutely fantastic for Scotland if we could host that event in Glasgow in 2013. Watch the press for details. Hebcelt, Hebridean Celtic Festival, itself selling over 17,000 tickets and bringing 1.5 million into the local economy. These are niche festivals, but they have major significance. And there are others like Pit and Weem in Fife, where people open up their homes as galleries to feature local artists. And then top of all of that, we've got the Fèis movement, with 32,000 young people last year involved in celebrations in 43 communities. Many of these events have become the events that define the place. And actually, the more local they are, the more global their appeal. And I want to tell you a story about a show that we helped commission in Newcastle. There's a writer called Lee Hall, who people may know. He wrote Billy Elliot, the play Billy Elliot, which went on to be the film. And we commissioned a new play from Lee Hall to open a small new writing theatre in Newcastle. It's called Pitman Painters. It's a play in the broadest dialect possible about a miners' WEA painting club in Northumberland. It was essentially as local as you can get in writing about a place. But it's run for almost 12 months in London at the National Theatre, and it's now being performed in Austria and on Broadway. It's another example of how something that has essentially local content can appeal internationally. And we have many successes here. Dundee Rep, who just won the Top Theatre Award actually for their show Sweeney Todd. They won the TMA Awards for the best theatre production in the UK. They've been touring Sunshine on Leith, again, a show that's very... So, What will Creative Scotland do that is different to its predecessors? Well, we're going to try and promote and celebrate that success. We're going to work in partnership with others and try and package things together to really shine that light on the cultural strength of Scotland. We want to look at the whole cultural ecology rather than taking isolated funding decisions on individual organisations and grants. This is an image of an organisation called WASPS. WASPS is an organisation that builds artist studios. They've got 19 facilities in Scotland, housing 750 creative artists and cultural entrepreneurs. And they have further plans to roll out spaces across Scotland. We need to work with agencies like WASPS to make sure that we've got the environment for artists to work. Now, some people have said that the loss of the Arts Council will mean the end of art for art's sake, and I've been criticised in the press for saying that, so I'm going to say some more controversial things now of that nature. Actually, I don't think there is such a thing as art for art's sake. I think it's a myth that's been perpetuated by traditionalists who see culture as being more important than any other sector. I feel culture is hugely important and probably one of the most important things in life. It differentiates where we are, who we are, and what we are. But there's rarely art for art's sake. I can think of very few examples. I once was approached by an artist who wanted to plant 1,000 acorns in an artistic pattern around the city of Newcastle. 1,000 acorns. He only wanted £2,000 to plant the 1,000 acorns. And it was a real dilemma. Did we invest in the artist's idea? Trouble was, we wouldn't see the results for 30 years. There's always another purpose, though, or benefit. There's an engagement with audience, even if it's 30 years down the line. There's a development of an idea. There's an investment in talent or a contribution to some political debate. In the case of the 1,000 acorns, the issue was the environment and climate change. But this was 20 years ago. 20 years ahead of when climate change became a central concern for society. There may not be art for art's sake, but artists often, through their art, create thinking about the future of our society. Now, what I absolutely believe in is the individual artist, musician and filmmakers and investing in them, giving artists status, giving artists time. Too often, artists have been subservient to the agencies that commission them. Not so here in Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, I have to say. But we'd like to find ways in which we give artists bottles to take to the party, that we enable artists to have the cards to play, that they have the investment to lever other investment, the scope to take risks and to innovate, the time to test ideas, the space to reach communities, and the licence to work outside of Scotland and to reach the rest of the world. We want to put a renewed commitment on the individual artist. I came to Sabhal Mòr Ostaig in May, and this really is an inspirational place. Boyd and Donny were the perfect hosts and tour guides. But it proved to be a key moment in the development of some of the thinking that's now evolving in Creative Scotland. I met with the artists in residence. We've had our photos taken so many times this afternoon in an inspirational setting outside the flat there. And what's happening here was something very special. Artists being given that space, being given that time, and being given inspirational places to work. But there were 3 residencies, 3 applications to the Arts Council, 3 grants, 3 lots of checks, 3 lots of monitoring. I went on to meet artists in residence at Cove Park, Dumbarton, and Orkney, and I saw work of real quality, making a massive impact locally, but not seen by the rest of Scotland. This is an image of Cove Park, of some of the artist studios there made out of porta cabins. I came back to the office in Edinburgh and asked how many artists in residence did we support, and nobody knew. So we went out and we researched it, and initially it came back at 57, and then it kept being added to, and it became 68. artist residencies or awards that we're currently supporting across Scotland. Most of them unconnected, doing fantastic work, but unconnected. So, this is the first time we've announced this. Today, we're announcing that we're going to add £1 million to launch a new artist residency programme called Creative Futures. It's going to be a single Creative Scotland artist residency programme that respects the work that's happening in places like Sabhal Mòr Ostaig and Cove Park and the programmes that they run. But it's a way of trying to join up what will become 200 plus artist residencies and awards a year, a programme which we think will be unrivalled in Europe. We're going to devolve our money to residency hosts like Sabhal Mòr Ostaig to deliver residencies on behalf of a Creative Scotland. And the difference is that every one of those individual artists will be connected to each other through social networks, through coming together to share their experience and to celebrate the work that they've produced while spending time. We're going to promote the work and encourage, we won't force, but we'll encourage the artists to come together as an alumni. 200 this year, 1,000 by 2014, and so on. We hope that they'll stay connected and committed to a Creative Scotland, so when we come back later on in careers and invite them to come back and do work, they'll feel that they want to continue contributing to that career ladder that we suggested earlier. The investment is primarily in individual talent, but the benefits will flow into places, into communities, and into many younger artists and students in colleges like this. It's a photo this morning. I'm really pleased, and have quite deliberately chosen here to make this announcement, that this residencies programme is going to enhance the programme here at Sabhal Mòr Ostaig. We want this to be one of our primary residency hosts. We already support 3 residencies here in what will become a single grant, Donny, and a single programme. But today we're going to add to that and announce investment in a new drama residency linking Sabhal Mòr Ostaig with RSAMD. This has the potential to strengthen the Gaelic drama sector, and the National Theatre of Scotland has also expressed an interest in being involved. I think this is very important because it will strengthen the position of this college as a national centre for the development of the Gaelic language and the role that culture and the arts play. And linked to this, we've started some discussions, and Sabhal Mòr have expressed an interest in hosting an annual artist conference here on Skye to bring together some of our Creative Futures artists. And I can imagine that will be one popular conference for people to come and celebrate the work that they've been doing as musicians, as filmmakers, as composers, as poets, wherever they've been in Scotland. We also want to develop a special relationship here with the college to explore other projects, working in partnership with Gaelic agencies in both the Highlands and elsewhere. Sabhal Mòr is shortly to advertise a post of Arts Development Officer, and I think this represents a real commitment by the board to develop the arts. Creative Futures, the artist programme, will doubtless get some tabloid stories tomorrow or later in the week, claiming that we're lining the pockets of artists when the average artist's salary is still just over £5,000 a year. Such claims ring very hollow. We often get criticised for supporting the usual suspects or the over-adventurous or risky. But we're going to devolve that decision-making to organisations like Sabhal Mòr, to over 40 residency hosts across Scotland. Investing in individuals is very important, but I wanted to tell you a story about another dilemma that I found in a previous job working at Northern Arts. We looked after the arts for Cumbria and used to support a very popular crafts residency in Grisdale Forest in Cumbria. It was a year-long residency, £20,000, and there were always at least 60 artists applied for the residency. One artist was appointed and they were delighted and they had a fantastic time. They produced an exhibition, they had a year on their own, but 59 artists didn't get any work and were pretty unhappy with Northern Arts and Grisdale. Following year, we invested the same £20,000 in a public art agency for Cumbria. And within the space of 18 months, that public art agency had generated £1 million of commissions for artists. £1 million. Which was right, to invest the money in the individual artist or to invest the money in the public art agency? Well, the answer is that there is no right answer. Both were right. But it poses the dilemma of choice that an agency like Creative Scotland has to embrace. We have to be trusted to take decisions in both directions, both to support the individual creator and to spot that opportunity for economic growth. So when I get criticised in the press for talking about investment and talking about enterprise agencies and Scottish Enterprise and HIE, I put it to the press and put it to you. The key part of our role is to find more resources to invest in the arts, as well as investing in individuals on their own terms. I also want to talk a little bit about taking risks. For those that don't know what this image is, it's St Peter's Seminary in Cardross, one of the most important architectural buildings in Scotland. Last week, ourselves and the Scottish Government backed Glasgow-based MVA to present at the Venice Architectural Biennale. It was an exhibition about an artist-led plan to save St Peter's Seminary and turn it into a national treasure, exhibiting sculpture. This building is going to rack and ruin. When I visited it a few weeks ago, there were young people setting fire to rafters. There were two teenagers with guns firing pot shots at cans on the building. It is a national treasure, and it needs to be retained as a national treasure. But it will be a major risk to invest in an agency to turn this into a major sculpture project. But we mustn't back away from things where the box says too difficult. The V&A in Dundee has really gathered a momentum because of the strong vision and the can-do attitude of the local authority and the universities there. I believe the Charles Jenks, Andy Goldsworthy Gateway sculpture in Gretna is also a hugely visionary project. I was involved last week in helping select the shortlist for artists, architects and engineers to go forward for that project. It's got the potential to become a major gateway to Scotland and a new contemporary icon for the nation. Creative Scotland needs to allow for this sort of ambition. Now, we're in a film studio and we're being filmed by MG Albert, so I ought to say a few words about film. And film investment will be another of Creative Scotland's central planks. Our location service couldn't want for better scenery. This is the white beaches just south of Moray, which we used for Local Hero. Settings like the bridge at Glenfinnan you used for Harry Potter. We do very well in attracting film productions to come to Scotland. However, our indigenous film production, compared to the story I told you earlier about music or national cultural facilities, our film industry is somewhat weak. There's no shortage of creativity. However, if we continue to invest in a cultural script-by-script route, we'll always be a bit part player in a film industry. We need to find new models of support and recognise that other investors will be required. Investors may be in Scotland, but they could equally be in Ireland, Denmark or Hong Kong. And in fact, there's work going on between here, Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, and Ireland, looking at a potential film investment that specialises in children's work. Our emphasis at Creative Scotland will be about giving resources to people who can lever new money for the film sector. We also need to get those enterprise agencies involved and investing in film. And this is a really tough ask. It's quite easy to see the economic value of a new renewable energy plant or a wind farm. It's less so to see the economic viability of a film script about delinquent teenagers in Glasgow. So whilst Creative Scotland sometimes gets money back from films, we had a cheque just the other week for $60,000 from the last King of Scotland, we haven't really been big enough players to generate real returns in the film industry. I suspect it's going to be a long haul to build a strong film industry, and the most important part of that is likely to be building our relationship with broadcasters. The BBC has made a really major commitment to growing its production base in Scotland, and Creative Scotland is now working in a partnership with the BBC, which enables us to have a single conversation with the BBC. In the past, we may just talk to them about film or had a minor conversation with them about festivals, but we've now developed a partnership where we can talk about film, drama production, online, digital content, festivals, education work, and news. It's early days, but the potential of this sort of partnership is huge, and we're going to assign somebody full-time from Creative Scotland to work on that particular partnership. And we're also developing partnerships with STV, Channel 4 and NG Alba. The plans, some of you may have read about it, for a Scottish digital network would be transformational for the sector. If I can put this into perspective, the idea is to have a new digital network and channel for Scotland, and it would need something like £75 million a year to make it work. That would deliver something like £50 million into the cultural economy and into film production, news production and cultural content production. That's about 10 times what we currently spend on film production through Creative Scotland. So it would have a massive effect if it went ahead. It's a tough call in the current economic climate, but I, for one, will be championing it in the hope that we might find a way of getting resources into a new digital network. Through MG Alba, we have another strong link to Sabhal Mòr. We're supporting their exploration of a new Gaelic soap. It needs to prove its feasibility, but the opportunity for this to link into the broader role for promoting Gaelic culture is obvious. I should say a few words, or a few more words, on Gaelic, even if my language skills preclude me from speaking in Gaelic just yet. We have, as I said earlier, a Gaelic arts officer shared with and based at Bord na Gaelic in Inverness. And Brian's going to take a lead on coordinating work for us with the Gaelic arts strategy. But this can't be the responsibility of one body. It needs a broader church, and I think the college here has to be a fundamental part of that process of defining national policy. Creative Scotland currently supports a number of agencies that help promote Gaelic culture. Ty Kershava in North Uist, partners for the stunning Chris Drury exhibition, which we'll see later on this evening. Feish Ross, Feish na Gaelic, Gaelic Books Council, and this wonderful building in Stornoway. There's also work going on here with Film G. You may have seen the posters outside, but Film G promote the Gaelic film competition, and I understand that they've just had some 71 films presented for the latest competition, a 30% increase on previous years, and 37 of those from young people between the ages of 12 and 17. Now, I know that many here share an ambition for Gaelic to be more than a minority language. Like Creative Scotland, this can be seen as a movement or a rallying call. And from what I hear, and I'm new to this entirely, the signs are good. People are queuing to get into Gaelic schools in Edinburgh and Glasgow. There's a new Gaelic centre being proposed in Inverness. The language has been given a major boost, as announced in previous lectures, through the commitment of the government to legislation. But I believe the arts and film have a hugely important part to play. We all know how poetry, music and the visual arts can transcend language. Yesterday, on my epic 15 hours on a train, I watched Murray Grigger's film on the Great Book of Gaelic. And what struck me was that when the roots are so deep, shoots will always grow stronger. If you think about it, the roots of the Gaelic language and the roots of culture are very deep. And they appear to be growing stronger and stronger all the time here in Scotland. And I think some of our cultural organisations will play a really important role in bringing contemporary Gaelic culture alive and reaching new audiences. I want to say a brief word on politics. I'll come to this image in a minute. We live in very political times, and there are elections ahead in Scotland. I did the big debate for the BBC in May. It's a radio thing. And on the panel with me was Fiona Hislop, who's a fantastic champion for the arts and culture, Labour spokesperson, Lib Dem spokesperson, Conservative spokesperson, and they were all competing as to who could be the most supportive for the arts, who could back Creative Scotland the more. They were all passionate and committed to the role that culture had to play in Scotland. But our agency is a construct of two successive governments and will need to bridge any change in the future. And it's important that we're allowed to operate at arm's length and to provide that ability to take risks. It's a good thing to get guidance from governments and direction at times, so long as it comes with pound notes or yen or euros. I don't mind the currency. It's also a good thing to have opposition that question and challenge and scrutinise what we do. But it's important that the politics doesn't stifle the creativity and doesn't stop us from taking risks and being valued for the way in which we as cultural organisations and as artists can define the role that the arts play in Scotland. Now, our core grant from government is £35.5 million. To put it in perspective, it's one school, it's painting the Forth Road Bridge twice, it's Wayne Rooney's salary at Manchester United for 2.5 years. It's actually only a third of what's just been cut from the Arts Council of England's budget by the UK government. These are really difficult economic times. Threats on colleges, on further education, local authorities and many other sectors. It's therefore quite remarkable vote of confidence in Creative Scotland and the cultural sector that last week it was announced that Creative Scotland's budgets won't be cut at all. It will be protected, as will our £10 million for the Youth Music Initiative across Scotland, £2 million for our Cultural Expo Fund, promoting product made in Scotland internationally, and support for our Arts and Business Initiative. I think the fact that our organisation has exceeded its targets in saving money on its own overheads, we've saved £700,000 this year, has probably helped us. But it actually means that next year we can spend more, not less. And that's a very good place to be at the moment. But the arts may not be immune from future cuts, but its impact is huge. Culture really is one of Scotland's great success stories. As I said earlier, it defines who we are, where we are, and our contribution to the world. There's many convincing economic facts. For every £1 that's spent by the public purse at the Edinburgh festivals, there's £61 raised back into the economy. For every £1, the £61 comes back into the economy. But there's a bigger message. Creative Scotland contributes to our everyday quality of life and also to the competitiveness of Scotland as a place to live, work, learn and visit. Remember the China figures and remember the scale. If culture can be delivered across all our communities, it does make us a more competitive place to learn and to live and work. And I think we particularly owe it to the next generation of young people in Scotland. Things like the Youth Music Initiative are delivering generational change, opportunities in music tuition that are just not available in many European countries. And our new Education and Culture Action Plan with the government, developed with Learning and Teaching Scotland, will introduce more creativity into classrooms. I saw a fantastic project last week. I was speaking to the Association of Directors of Education, and a project called Visible Fictions, where for a whole 2 weeks, 6 local authorities worth of secondary school kids had been brought into an emergency situation and using film and culture and creativity to explore how they would deal with a situation of war. A really creative process that was embedding the arts into all aspects of the curriculum. But these things can be swept aside by political change, as has just happened with the UK government in England. It's my hope that Scotland recognises the importance of this cultural sector and puts aside any politics. Yes, there'll be noise in the press about Creative Scotland and what we do, fuelled by a few detractors, but at the heart of a successful Creative Scotland, it'll be long-term policies, policies that span generations, tradition in the making, talent in the making, a creative economy in the making. These things don't take weeks, they don't take months, they take decades. Onto this image. This was a project I went to see on Friday. It's an image of an eco-city in Dunfermline, facilitated by the Buyer Theatre and I think a group from the Youth Parliament. It involved a group of young people aged 8, 9, 10 years old from 6 primary schools, and they produced a complete town plan and a model of their vision for the future of Dunfermline. The image I'm showing you here is probably about 20% of the scale of the model. The town planner in me got very excited. Here we had 9-year-olds visioning aerial walkways accessible to the entire population, roads that bent called Snake Street that weren't straight rows, underground car parks with views underneath the river so you could see the salmon coming up. This was the next generation of Creative Scotland at work. As the phrase goes, Rome wasn't built in a day. Rome stood the test of time because it had very strong foundations. And we have the same in the arts in Scotland, foundations that really will be the pillars of Scotland's creative future and of generations to come. And I don't just mean our foundation organisations like Scottish Dance Theatre, High Arts or Antoba, but the importance of institutions like this at Sabhal Mòr, developing a significant national contribution to the arts and language. 2012 will be the year of Creative Scotland. People may not have noticed, it's actually the Cultural Olympiad, but the government has announced a series of themed years, and 2012 will be Creative Scotland Year. It's a fantastic opportunity to deal with that issue of not celebrating, to tackle that issue of shining a light on the quality of what happens through our cultural sector. It's a real opportunity to get Scotland dancing, to achieve mass participation, to promote the work of individual artists, to recognise our historic names in culture and to celebrate our contemporary icons. It's a chance for us to promote through our festivals on a world stage the talent of today's Creative Scotlands. There's no reason why we couldn't have a national artist or a national composer as well as a national poet. It's a year when we can start to define the way that Scotland promotes itself nationally and internationally. It's early days for us at Creative Scotland, the organisation, but I hope you'll all find a way to join us in what will be an interesting journey. Let's use 2012 as a moment to celebrate, and let's come back and look in 2 decades' time at how far things have moved on in this wonderful creative nation. Thank you. t-Sabhail.
Well, Andrew, well, ladies and gentlemen, where to begin to respond to that? I saw Boyd looking anxiously at his watch. If we've overrun, it's only because there was so much that was good, so much good news in that. You said, Andrew, near the start that there's a bad, we'd chosen wisely in the sense of not inviting a politician to address us because politicians aren't in any situation where they can come with money and commitments anymore. But we're glad that you have come with both. And if I may start with the particular, because you came with a great deal more than that, but I'll start with that, with the particular good news which you brought us, and then make some comments about what I thought was a very, very reassuring approach by yourself to our situation here and the position of Gaelic within Scotland, as well as your understanding of Scotland generally. As to the particular, we welcome very, very warmly what you've announced today in the way of an additional residency here. That in itself would be just a huge step forward for which we would be so grateful and are. But more than that, you've announced things which will transform the basis of residency programmes here and elsewhere throughout Scotland. Securing funding, we've always been grateful for our funding, but securing funding has always involved an annual pitch for the funding. It's always had to be renewed. It's never been certain for years to come. What you've announced today, Andrew, transforms the basis of that in terms of the stability and the permanence of residency programmes. And what you've announced in the way of conferences for residencies throughout Scotland and the role this college might have in that is particularly gratifying. And for that alone, it would be well worth having you give this lecture. So.